I'm going to do a coffee roast using the Gene Cafe model CBR 101. This model does a half pound of coffee. The Behmor does up to a pound of coffee. However, I always did a half pound on my Behmor because I got a more even profile when I did that. So to start with, I'm going to remove the canister, pull back this little lever, and it'll slide out. Open the top and then load your beans. Here I've loaded about a half pound of beans, and you can see there's a line there that will roughly correspond to a half pound, and I would not recommend exceeding that line or it can restrict airflow. So I'm going to reinsert it. It'll clip back into place, that trigger that we released earlier. And I'm roasting a half pound of one of my favorite beans for espresso, which is Tanzania Peaberry from coffeeproject.com. So to start with, I'm going to power on the unit, and it'll tell you ambient temperature and target temperature, which you can see there. The target is 447. So I'm going to set time here, and I usually start it at about 17 minutes, and I'm going to come back and gauge it into where I want it at the end, but that's what I will start it with, and then go ahead and hit the start button. And as you can see, it'll rotate off axis, and there's really not much to see here, so I'm going to come back in about 10 minutes and see how it looks. Okay, it's been a little over 10 minutes. You can see I have 4 minutes left. And you can see the target temperature and the actual temperature back and forth on the display as it tries to maintain that target and heating up and cooling down. One of the main differences in the experience between the Gene Cafe and the Behmor is that with the Gene Cafe, you are primarily dependent on eyesight and the appearance of the roast. My ears cannot pick up the sound of the bean cracking with the Gene Cafe. When I had the Behmor, I could hear it very clearly, and so I could gauge my roast level by the crack, first crack and second crack. With the Gene Cafe, I'm highly dependent on the appearance of the bean. That's probably the most noticeable difference in my opinion. I mentioned not exceeding that fill line, and the reason is that you can see the chaff collecting in an exit vent there, and if you have too many beans, it'll build up and block that and restrict the airflow. You can also see the weighted rake going back and forth, and it's raking the chaff across the slats in that vent, and it eventually breaks them down, and they collect here in this chaff collector, which needs to be emptied every 3 to 5 roasts, I would say, depending on your level of chaff. But I'm going to let these go for a little bit longer before I hit cool. I'm going to pause for now. All right, at this point, I think I'm going to be done with this roast. One thing I do to sometimes get a better idea of doneness, depending on my lighting, is I'll take a flashlight and I'll put it right up to the bean, and the color rendering from my camera and a display is going to be off from what you actually see, so it's hard to tell what these actually look like. But for where I want this to be, I'm going to call it done. That beep tells me that there's a minute left, but at this point I'm going to be done, and I'm going to hit cool, and you can see now that it's going to read out the actual temperature. So this is another big difference between the Gene and the Behmor, is that you can open up the front door and blow in cold air with a fan or whatever and drop the temperature very rapidly. With the Gene Cafe, it's enclosed, and so the temperature has to go down very slowly, and so you'll continue to get a little bit of roasting for a couple of minutes until that temperature drops down below maybe 350 or so. And so that's one noticeable difference in experience, is you have to assume a little bit of roast on the tail end. The beans have cooled, and so we can remove the canister. Will still be a little warm, but shouldn't burn you. When you remove the beans, I recommend that you use something with a large enough diameter. Otherwise, beans will kind of get hung up on that weight there and could then come loose and fall around on the floor. So usually you want something with a big enough diameter to dump into cleanly. So you can see the beans kind of hung up on the weight there. So there's my roast. I'm going to let that sit for a couple days before I use it. And the chaff is in the chaff collector from this and a few other prior roasts. So you can remove it fairly easily. And then it has a twist cap on the end. You can turn it about 45 degrees and it'll open up. So you can see the chaff collected in there. You can easily dump it into the garbage and dispose of it. The chaff collector is another major benefit of the Gene compared to the Behmor. With the Behmor, the chaff will just collect in the bay, and then it'll kind of tend to blow all over and can make a mess, but may or may not be an issue if you're in the garage. That is basically the roast on Gene Cafe.